Okay, welcome everyone to today's learning session where we're going to be learning about this guide here on reflexive thinking, the Reflexive Thinking Canvas. We're going to be doing a workshop for the next hour. I'm Josh Costa, I'm with the SI London Hub team. I also have Manali with me here today as co-host. And great to have you joining. Looks like just a small group. I'm sure more will be joining as we go along. So here we are. This is what we'll be covering today. We're going to be looking at that canvas. We'll share the links with you for the canvas and the guides as we get towards the end. But first, going to give a presentation as to what we're talking about when we talk about reflexive thinking. And then we're going to give examples of how to use this canvas. And then down here, we'll actually have you join us and participate in working with Canvas so that you get experience with that. So if you have any questions, comments, you're welcome to drop them in the chat, and Manali will pick them up as we go along. And I'm going to jump right in. Hopefully you're all familiar with Miro. We've just shared the link with you, and you can join on the Miro board when you're ready. And let's get started. So here it is, reflexive thinking. So reflexive thinking is about becoming aware of how our thinking shapes what we see, do, and the world we create, which then feeds back to shape our thinking through an ongoing feedback loop. In this exercise, in this canvas here is essentially based upon that feedback loop, looking at how our thinking feeds through to shape the world, what we do and the world we live in and so forth. So that's the essence of what we're covering today. We're trying to become aware of how our thinking shapes everything we do. Okay, so here we are. Systems thinking is about trying to improve the quality of our thinking. So as to not just see parts, but instead to see systems. But instead to see systems, the systems we form part of in our world. For most adults, seeing systems does not come naturally. In our everyday way of being, we see parts and draw a few connections that are very much centered around us and our particular place in the world. To see systems is to, in some way, overcome this self-centered view of the world. So, have you checked the events page, Manali, to make sure everything's okay there? I'm not sure if we have everyone here.
Yeah, let me just check again.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so to see systems is to in some way overcome this self-centered view of the world and become aware of our underlying mental models. So this requires us to overcome some of the limitations, flaws, and bias in our thinking resulting from our egoism, so as to see the systems we form part of independent from ourselves. Calling oneself a systems thinker should be a commitment to an ongoing learning process of examining and trying to improve our thinking to become better at seeing systems. This starts with understanding how we see the world and the existing limitations in our reasoning. So that's a kind of key part of it, becoming aware of our mental models and our ways of seeing the world so that we can potentially overcome those and see the broader systems we form part of. So, why reflexive thinking? And this is a great quote. We've met the enemy and he is us. This is a saying from the cartoon character called Pongo. It captures a key aspect to systems thinking. It starts with the recognition that our thinking and worldview determine how we act, which leads to the worlds we create around us. If we want paradigm shifting breakthroughs, it will happen by changing our way of thinking, And this will only happen by investing time and energy in understanding our ways of thinking and their limitations. So we have to become aware of our current way of thinking before we're going to overcome it. If there's something systemically dysfunctional about a system we create, then the real issue is likely not out there, but instead a product of our ways of thinking. And that goes back to we've met the enemy, and he is us, essentially coming from our way of thinking that's creating these systemic problems. So starting from the beginning with systems change means an assessment of our worldview, how we look at the world. This is called reflexive thinking. Systems thinking starts by being reflexive about our worldview, and from this assessment of our ways of thinking, we can use critical thinking to do that. So this is reflexive thinking here. It refers to a circular relationship between cause and effect. In the context of thinking, it refers to the bidirectional relationship between our subjective understanding of the world and the objective world we perceive. That everything we see is a function of our perception, which is a product of our conceptual categories and paradigms. Our mental models shape what we see, but then there's a feedback loop where what we see also shapes our categories and perceptions. So that's illustrated here. This cyclical relationship, our conceptual models or paradigms forms the conceptual models and categories through which we interpret things, and that shapes, then you can see up here what we see. Our conceptual models shape everything that we see, kind of frames what we look at, what we focus on, what we pay attention to, and thus what we perceive, which then shapes what we do. How we see the world determines how we act, how we design, we go about designing and managing systems, which ultimately down here results in the world we create. Our activities create the world we live in, which feeds back to shape our thinking again. So it's actually a cyclical relationship, a feedback loop. Okay, so that's the general model. And the Canvas is obviously based on this. It's trying to help people think about how this shapes their worldview, how their mental models here shape what they see, which shapes how they act, which shapes the world we create. And that can be applied in almost any context, but ultimately we're trying to shift people's perception to a kind of systemic or holistic view, which leads potentially to a more coherent understanding of the world. And from that, the result can be a more integrated way of seeing the world around us. And from this, we can act from a broader awareness of the systems we form part of. And we create systems that are better integrated and work for all. So that's what we're trying to do, shift the thinking, become aware of our mental models, how they shape our perception and ways of acting in the world, and then try and shift that to a more holistic view so that we ultimately act from a broader awareness of the systems we form part of and create better systems. Does everybody understand that? Any questions or comments? Feel free to unmute yourself if you want to share anything. We're just a small group today. Okay, so we stay going. Down here, we have examples of what this looks like in the Canvas. So I posted up here the example of a water system, and it shows how we are thinking here, right? This is the Canvas you'll find on the website. It's just been updated a little bit. On the left, actually we've broken into two boxes. On the left, we can see the current thinking, so we're going to post these up. And then on the right, we're going to see systems thinking. So we're going to try and, on this box, become aware of what our thinking is like from a reductionist paradigm, kind of traditional perception. And then on the right here, what it's like from a systems perception. So we can kind of iterate around first in terms of a traditional perception, looking at these boxes on the left and filling those out so that we can see in the context of this system, if we take this particular perspective, how does that feed through to what we see, and that feed through to how we act, and then back to the outcomes that we get. And then afterwards, we can iterate through the second set of boxes and start to think about, right, if we shift that paradigm to a systems thinking one, what does that mean in terms of our mental models? And then what does that mean in terms of what we see? So here we've taken the example of water system. And starting here, our current thinking, we might think about water as a thing, as a finite resource, as kind of an object. That might be a reductionist way, focusing on the parts and the properties of the parts. How much water do we have? And here that would shape our perception then, our looking at the world, our way of looking at the world, seeing it as a stock of water, and feed through to how do we act? We focus on having enough water, reserves of water. And then here is seeing water as a scarce resource, might be the outcome from that. Shifting the paradigm to a holistic one, we might start to see that water is in fact everywhere. And it's not so much a finite resource or a stock. It's more a question of flows and quality of water rather than it is a finite object. That leads to perception here, a different way of looking at the world. We start to see water is never used up. There are just changes in quality and accessibility of water rather than it being finite. That's a different way of looking at the world. And from that, a different way of acting, we start to design and manage for water quality instead of quantity. Very different way of managing and designing water systems, right? If we have that perception. And then down here, what kind of an outcome will we get? We might start to create circular water systems that focus on recycling and upcycling water instead of how can we get as much and store as much and reserve it as possible. So that's the canvas there. A simple iteration through it. You can see essentially how it works. So the canvas also contains kind of key questions you might ask people as you go along. So this first one here is around the mental models, trying to elicit people's mental models. In that first section, you could ask them questions like, what are the key words we use to talk about the system? Are those words listed above things or relations, patterns, and systems? Do these categorizations focus our attention on the parts or the whole? So this is helping people become aware of their conceptual models. Questions you'd ask as you go along. So next one, in terms of what do we see? In what way do I see the system from a self-centered perspective? These are questions you could ask people. How do others see the system from their self-centered perspective? How does this create a fragmentation in the system? So this is correlated, this is relating to this section here. What do we see? And then how do we act? Is this third one here? And these are questions you might ask. How does what we see lead to what we do? How can looking at things differently change how we act? How is our acting fragmented? Our design and managing of systems. And then finally, the world we create. How does what we do lead to the systems we create? How does this lead to the challenges we face? And how does what we create then feed back to influence our thinking? So these are kind of key questions you could ask as you go through the workshop using this canvas. Hopefully that gives you a sense of what we're talking about here. Any questions before we move on? We're going to use the mirror board now to think about an example here. Okay, so who's with us on the mirror board? Caesar. Okay, one or two others. Do you want to, first we're going to take this example of security and ask how are we thinking about this system, security, should we say, in a kind of traditional approach. What does that look like? Does someone want to post up some ideas here? What is security? What's our kind of framing, our mental models, our categorization of security in a traditional perception? Okay, any other ideas here? Fear of security, security force, police, others pose a danger to me, security equals stability. Yeah, that's an interesting one. Belief that it's essential, necessary. What about the idea of, say, boundaries? That's often a kind of mental model that we hold, that we need to have boundaries. We need boundaries to secure. When we think of security, we often think of building walls and barriers. Any other ideas? This is kind of from the reductionist perspective, which is kind of looking at looking at the parts separated out. Defend oneself. Yeah. Prevent things from happening. Resist change. Any other ideas? Okay, so those are how are we thinking about this? How are we framing and categorizing it? It's often an individual thing. How do we protect ourselves in this perception? Okay, and how does that feed through to what we see and how we look at the world? Anybody have ideas on this? Yeah, it can be like a resistance to change, also trying to create barriers to change. Or more protection, leading to greater security, more resistance, leading to greater security, building higher walls and fences. I guess controlling is kind of part of this too here, like a capacity to control. And then maybe up here we're looking for the ability to, searching for the ability to control, and maybe cause and effect kind of relationships through which we can control things. Preventing things from happening, looking to stop certain things from happening. Or seeing change, seeing the threats in change. Okay, so let's take a look. How can we add more barriers versus how can we rethink the system? Increase of social divides, seeing divides as a way to secure oneself. More and more weapons, police, and animosities. Seeing the threats in change, yeah, create distance from neighbors. Yeah, think about in Israel or somewhere, what do they do when they feel insecure? They build a big wall and they buy more weapons. Antagonism. Or in America, they put people in jail to separate them from society. Antagonism, us versus we versus them. Competition versus collaboration. The tree hides the forest syndrome. What does that mean in this context? Someone want to share?
I just meant that like we take the sub part or the small part and then we kind of do an exponential, generalities, and that's a dangerous thing. We end up being taking the one tree for the whole forest and not being differentiated. So at the same time, you need to see the whole, but at the same time, you shall not equate the whole to the sub part.
Yeah, and we also kind of attribute things that are maybe part of the whole to the individual parts. Like if
Correct.
we're in a space where we don't feel safe, like in a dangerous neighborhood, we see someone who's representative of that, and then we project it onto them. Yeah. Okay. Defocusing from big picture and whole system, preventing things from happening, cause and effect relationships to control. I mean, this is quite primordial, isn't it? It's what we do as animals. We try and understand basic relationships and hold the things that might lead to things that affect us, try and control them and stop them from changing. Okay, how can we add more barriers versus how we can rethink this increase of social divides? Yeah, so this is a paradigm, right? A way of looking at the world. We're going to have security when we're thinking about security. How can we secure ourselves? We're looking at the individual parts and we're thinking about, well, how can we control them? How can we resist certain bad things happening? How can we create barriers? And when we look at the world through that lens, we start to look for these kind of cause and effect relationships everywhere. We start focusing on properties that are a function of the whole, like a neighborhood or a community. We kind of attribute those to individuals. We start looking for how we can create borders and barriers and separate ourselves from risks and threats, and preventing things from happening, resisting things in case they lead to the things we're scared of, right? Okay, so that's the second part there. Let's jump into now here. This section is really about how do we act? How do we then, from that perspective, go about designing systems and managing systems when we're taking this perspective to security? So let's take a couple of minutes to do that. Yeah, maybe we have an issue with the timing thing, Manali, because of the time change that we saw before.
Yeah, even I was wondering about that. Probably the calendar, people had it in calendar as per the previous timing.
We might have to run another workshop afterwards, unfortunately. That was 6:30. Yeah, okay, we stay going anyway. Great. So let's take a look at some of these. I guess the essence of this, kind of going back here, you know, reductionism is about dividing things up and kind of separating them out and looking at them as individual units and their properties. So I guess that's really all the way through here. It's going to be key, this idea of security as separation, right? And you can see that's pretty foundational in our societies, isn't it? As I talked about jails. Jails are a very good example of that. We're separating ourselves from the people we think are damaging or harmful in society, and also these borders and these boundaries we created, nation states or the walls and so forth. The Great Wall of China, built to keep the Mongols and so forth out in northern China. So you can see that paradigm really feeding through here, or security, you know, gated communities are good examples of this. So it's going to feed all the way through to how we go about designing and building systems inevitably. And when you look out there in the world and how we do security, we put literally 90 to 90% of our resources and money into resisting and building borders and barriers and securing those borders and barriers, and we put very little of it, 1%, into actually trying to, you know, going back to the Israel example, put very little into actually improving the condition for the people they're trying to, who they think are harmful. And someone's put it here around collaboration. I think avoid collaboration, is it? Yeah. So, you know, this could be one way. If we're looking at it very differently, we'll be thinking a lot more about collaboration. We'll get to that in a minute. But here we're thinking about how can we keep them down? How can we secure them and hold them in the jail being a good example. So worrying about the difference for us, race, sex, religion. Yeah, it's an interesting one. Anybody want to talk on that? We find people who are different, we're sometimes scared of them, aren't we? Just because they're different. Train to walk with purpose. Don't look like you don't know where you're going. Focus on technology rather than building relationships with the enemy. Yeah, that's a lot of what we do, isn't it? It's like national security budget. It goes on high-tech weapons, doesn't go on building relationships with the enemy. Decrease in empathy and curiosity. Why criminals commit crimes in the first place. Yeah, we just kind of focus on them in a static way, don't we? They cause that crime and they should be punished, a kind of a linear kind of cause and effect sort of perspective. It's not thinking so much about the whole context from which they've come. More and more laws and stricter punishment, upward spiral. Avoiding collaboration, focus on symptoms, crimes rather than root causes. Focus on suppression of crime rather than on solving the underlying issues. Populist attitudes, say what people want to hear. Yeah, punishment when people have been, some wrong has been done. It's often the politician who comes along and says, we will punish them because that's what people want to hear. Myths on diversity of views and talent, away from dialogue towards monologue. Yeah, that's, anybody want to talk on that? We often kind of reduce down, don't we, when we experience a threat and get locked into a particular dimension.
It's a bit connected to the control from before. So when things get too difficult to apprehend and fear are too strong, then you tend to go in the echo chamber and speak to the people like you and reduce the surface to regain an illusionary sense of control.
Yep, again, reducing down to a single dimension and then a kind of reactive mode of cause and effect. Okay, simple recipes for complex issues. Focus on risk versus opportunities. Focus on people like me, echo chambers. buying weapons for protection. Okay, great. Hopefully that gave you an experience there. What we're talking about, the gut is either an enabler to move or a blocker, using gut before head. Okay, so there we were in the third section there, thinking about the kind of ways we'll go about acting if we're what's following from this reductionist paradigm and way of looking at the world. Finally, what kind of a world would that create? What are the outcomes that we get? We see some of these around us, as mentioned, you know, the US kind of incarceration system, or many parts of the world that build big walls and barriers and invest heavily in weapons as a way of securing themselves. So let's take a couple minutes to post up here. Any ideas you have on this? We're just doing this box on the left at the moment. After this one, we'll get to thinking about the systems perspective of this, or a more holistic view on it. We're asking what kind of a system would result from this view of the world. Do you have a link, Eric? You joined later. Do you want to join us on the mirror board? Or?
Yeah, I've joined. I put a green sticker, so Valerie just told me, as she's in another room here, that I'm not supposed to work on the future. So I did in parallel, but maybe because I missed the beginning of the format.
Yeah. Okay. Just well, we'll refresh now in a minute the overall format. Yeah. Any other ideas here? We should move on shortly for the sake of time. I mean, this worldview, our worldviews always end up, what we're talking about here is how does this really turn into something concrete out there in the world, right? You know, walls are physical manifestations of the kind of categories we create in our minds, right? Those borders between nations, they don't exist there. We created that out of our institutional our conceptual categorizations, the nation state, and our institutions, that actual thing, that societal institution out there in the world. And then actually we went and put police there, we went and put walls and so forth there. So they're actually, when you look at it from this perspective, you start to see those things that look very tangible out there in the world are created by our conceptual models. There is really nothing, when you go to the border of a nation, there's really nothing there except for the things we created conceptually and ended up, as we're talking about here, in actual physical things that we think are real. So yeah, we'll take a look at this for the sake of time. So negative synergies, 1 + 1 equals -1. That's what we get in conflict, isn't it? Services for crime victims, survivors, limited and revolve mostly on sentencing outcomes. Life sentence, imprisonment outside the prison. Intergenerational fate, repetition over the long term, more prisons, stricter laws, more violence, less tolerance. Gun lobby has a lot of power in the US, yes, and we give them that power, don't we, to a large extent by this way of thinking that we need more weapons to secure ourselves. Okay, so that's that. This section here is talking about the actual concrete manifestation of this paradigm, right? And the whole idea going back here is that our mental models are creating the world we live in. So when we see those walls, that razor wire, those jails and so forth, they're actually an expression of a paradigm, a mental model. And by doing this exercise, we can start to see that, right? We can help participants to actually see that because most people don't really look at the world like that. They think the things out there are just out there and that's the way the world is. When we take this exercise, we can start to see actually a lot of them are really created by our way of viewing the world. And we can change that, right? And that's what we're getting at here. So Eric, just to refresh where we are, we have 4 dimensions here. We're looking at how our ways of thinking of the world shape our worldview up here, and that worldview shapes how we act and go about designing and managing systems, and ultimately the resulting system that is created out of that over time. And on the left, what we're just doing there was kind of, what does this whole system look like from the reductionist traditional approach that we know quite well? We know a lot about this approach to security. But there's another one, right? We could be looking at this in a holistic way. And that's what we'll get into now. What does security look like from a holistic perspective? Interesting question. Yep, Eric?
Just a question about how we are thinking, because we know that the thinking comes from our beliefs and values. But in this format, there is no need to go deeper than that. We start at the thinking level.
Yeah, well, you could put values and so forth, exactly as you say. This here is a paradigm, and I totally agree. Paradigms are constructed out of underlying values and beliefs, as you say, assumptions about the world. So you could put them in here. I mean, we're just using the word thinking. We could be using paradigm, and that would include, values and beliefs and so forth. So feel free to post those up. Okay, so here we are. Let's start here. What kind of mental models, what kind of fundamental beliefs and assumptions and values would be baked into a world view that was holistic, system thinking perspective of security? Just to remind ourselves, what do we mean systems thinking? Fundamentally, it's a holistic. Instead of reducing down to a single dimension, we're actually expanding out to something multidimensional. We're looking at this thing of security is actually pervasive and part of everything that we do, not just a single dimension. It's also a relational way of looking at the world. It's not about things, but it's about the relationship between different things. It's a dynamic way of looking at the world. Could be something about networks and like social networks that we're a part of, kind of networked view. I think it would be a worldview that's more about resilience rather than kind of resisting things. We're thinking about the resilience of the systems we create rather than preventing things. I think resilience has a certain acceptance that disruption and challenges are going to come, but we're still going to develop a system that has the capacity to kind of deal with that rather than try and resist and prevent it. There's going to be a certain acceptance, I'd say, in this worldview, isn't it? That some things will happen and that's the way it is. We're not going to be able to resist everything. Because this worldview, it kind of ends up narrowing down to trying to prevent everything, doesn't it? Like a dictator trying to get rid of every single little bit of resistance. I think here there is a degree of acceptance to and recognition that maybe this is part of the way the world is and part of development and so forth, that the tension and conflict is in some ways necessary. Yeah, embracing difference, not having a fear of difference. Is it kind of, there'd be a kind of maybe a creative destruction kind of acceptance, I think, that, you know, we can't resist everything, that sometimes there will be disruptions, there will be disturbances. Okay, we just have 10 minutes before we start this workshop again. So let's take a look. So networks of relationships, no blame and shame. Anybody want to say anything here that they think's particularly important?
But when you are part of a system, you know that you are a cause and an effect, and therefore at times you are and because it's multifaceted, you might be positive viewed from one perspective and totally negative from another perspective. So there is no possibility for blame and shame because it's the same in the one person. You are an angel and a devil in one suit.
Yeah, it's good point. Different perspectives on things, different contexts and different framings of things. Yeah. I think another interesting one is kind of, the holistic conception would help us to look at all different dimensions of risk, should we say? Because quite often, if you think about national security, we get very focused on the other country, the other nations are going to send bombs, when most of our risks are financial or they're cyber or they're climate change, you know, and we spend trillions or billions on more bombs to protect ourselves from another country that's probably not going to attack us when the biggest risk is probably climate change, and we don't really look at those, or it might even be, you know, social instability or whatever it is within the nation, but we end up spending trillions just focusing on our walls and our weapons. So we aren't actually thinking holistically about what are the real risks and threats we face quite often. And really, we get caught on one dimension, national security, as protecting ourselves from other nations that are going to attack us, when the threats in the world today are multifaceted and multidimensional, and they're often endogenous in our societies, right? Yes. Eric, did you?
Yeah, I completely agree, but I also see some difference. I'm Swedish as nationality, and I think from the UK and American perspective, this has been very much the cause of has been so much investment, probably overinvestment also in military. From Swedish-Finnish perspective, we have now woken up to a new reality that probably we did not do enough. We have not reached the basic threshold to defend our territory if need be, and the threat was bigger. So there is always this. It's not black and white, but I also agree the main threat as seen in Sweden is even today it's not Russia, even if it's bigger threat than before. It's climate crisis, and the concern is that now first with COVID, now with Ukraine, who is really taking the lead on climate change, which is the bigger threat than anything else.
Yeah, and pandemic's another one, right? We weren't even thinking about that. How much money did we invest in pandemic prevention, right? And how much it cost us, how many lives it took, and so forth. But it's totally good. Holism should mean both. It should mean like what you say about those kind of traditional threats of Russia, but also these new threats, right? So we shouldn't forget about both. Holism means both, it means all. Okay, so what do we see then from this perspective? When we look through this new lens, it's more about networks, it's more about inclusivity and creative destruction, kind of seeing both sides, both perspectives. What does the world look like then? It's not so easy to kind of separate ourselves from other people and say they're the enemy, right? And we're the good guys, and we need to build walls between us. What do we start to see when we look through that lens? So Andreas, are you looking for the links to this, or what do you mean by references?
Hi. Yeah, it's in the canvas. There's footnotes regarding text. I think it's on the critical or reflexive thinking. One of the slides or canvas. It says like number 4, and then it's.
Oh yes, sorry, yes, up here on these slides. Yes, you'll find that in the guide here. So those slides were taken from this guide, and you'll be able to find it in there. You'll find the link just here. So if you click there, it'll take you to the guide PDF, and then at the bottom of that, you'll have the footnotes, the references.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
So Manali, I don't think we should let people in because I think.
Yeah, I was just gonna ask you about that.
Yeah, we'll maybe have to.
Just, on the community, I can just look him up and drop him a message, or should I just drop a message on the event page?
You can. What are you going to say?
Oh, I mean, with the time difference, the time. I mean, there was an issue with the time zone.
Yeah, I think we just have to run the workshop again now in three minutes. So if you just put, don't worry, just don't let people in. We'll finish this one and then start again if there's many people.
Okay.
Okay, so here we are. We just have 3 minutes. What do we see? Views of an astronaut watching our blue planet. Our shared humanity is interconnected. Yeah. It's a powerful idea in systems thinking, interconnectivity and interdependence really is the big idea, isn't it? That even if they're the enemy, they are actually, they have a context, and they are ultimately, we're all part of the same networks, and we need to consider that and build responses and ways of dealing with things that reflect that interdependence. That, you know, if we have a criminal in our society, they're still part of our society, even if they're a criminal, and we need to figure out how to design systems that work with that. So see the whole versus only the parts of the subsystem. Different root, cause, and effect, enabling creative solutions to emerge. Yeah. Give voices to the foreign, find ways to have all voices at the table. Okay. Yeah, I'm not seeing difference as such a threat. And how do we work with difference? So don't turn away from problems or view them as someone else's problems to deal with. Instead, how can we help? Yeah, this might be not just focusing on things once they're a problem, you know, the way once someone causes a crime, we then focus on it, but how do we actually look at the whole kind of history and context of the whole thing in space and time, so that we can maybe get to a preventive, you know, a preemptive kind of mode of security, where it's not about punishing people, but actually how do we create the right context in the first place, invest in the context in the first place. So that might be down here, right, where we're really starting to think about, instead of investing in things that fix the problem once it's broken, how do we invest in the system in the first place, the context that these people find themselves in, so that we don't get this, the emergence of criminal activity and risks and threats associated with it. So using coverage to enable overcoming gut fears. Okay, so unfortunately we've run out of time. Hopefully that gave you a sense of how the canvas is working here. How going from, you know, how we're thinking to what do we see, how we're acting, and so forth. I think we're going to have to run this again with a few people are joining now, so we're going to have to wrap up. But down here at the bottom, you'll find both the canvas and the guide, and you'll be able to look through those. This is the next event coming up next week, and you can find us on our channels here. We'll share the video on YouTube and so forth. Okay, thank you all for joining. I hope to see you again soon. And you're welcome to stay if you want for the second iteration of this.
So thanks for the introduction. I think I got into it even if I came late.
Okay, you're welcome. You're welcome.
Yeah, take care. Cheers.
Bye. Yep. Huh, I wonder how many people will join now. Maybe we should just wait 1 minute to see.
How many would, or would you think it'd be better to, I mean, what would be better to continue right now or reschedule with the new time?
No, I think we'll, I'll stop recording. I think we'll go again.